So it's good to be back here. I think I've been here for maybe 5 of the 8 OpenStack days. I always love coming here and getting to catch up with the Israeli community and also hear about the progress. So I'm excited to hear from some of these new users throughout the day and see what's happening here. Nadi actually touched on a number of things that I was going to talk about, which is good because I don't have a lot of time and a lot of content to cover. So I'll skip through some of this. But how many of you were at the OpenStack Summit in Boston? Okay, so a decent number. So I wanted to kind of run through some of the things that happened there and just give a little bit of an overview. And then also talk a little bit about what I think is driving some of those trends that Nadi was talking about. The first one that I want to mention, which fits right along with some of the points that Nadi was making, is OpenStack is growing like crazy right now. We do a user survey, and in our most recent one that we wrapped up just a couple of months ago, the number of deployments that we tracked had grown 44% year over year. So that is, a very large increase in actual OpenStack deployments around the world. And this was across private clouds, but also in OpenStack public clouds and services that we had seen. And I think that why we were seeing that spike is because we've gotten to the point where, like Nadi said, new users can come in and they can take the software and they can deploy it much easier and more rapidly than a few years ago when it was a lot more difficult. And so we've kind of gone through that technology development phase and are now seeing this user adoption spike happening. We've talked about 50% of the Fortune 100 use OpenStack. Other thing that I think was interesting in this most recent survey, and this is an opt-in survey, so it doesn't capture every OpenStack deployment, but in the production deployments that we tracked, there were over 5 million physical cores in production. So that's a pretty big pool of compute resources around the world that's being managed by OpenStack. And 5 million cores, that can get a lot of work done out there. So what's driving that usage beyond just kind of OpenStack itself? I think that if you look at what we see everywhere in the world right now, we see that everything that we're doing as humans is actually tied to the ability to do computing. And whether you're talking about research or science or defense or finance or industry, manufacturing, anything, there are tie-ins to computing. And really, the big benefit of cloud is more and more as technologies come onto the scene and become adopted, become standards, and to be kind of the core functionality that people need in their business. We see that there are open source options that are driving it, that are starting it, that are moving it forward. And that's not the way that the IT industry operated for decades. So that's very exciting for me to see because it actually opens this up to more people all over the world. And as an example, AI and machine learning, this is one of the hottest areas in our industry right now. And if you look at the tools that are out there around doing big data analytics, machine learning, deep learning, there are open source alternatives from the largest tech players in the world that are being rapidly adopted. As I mentioned, I was just in Australia and I was talking with somebody at one of the largest banks down there. They run a pretty big OpenStack environment. They use a lot of Ironic for bare metal, like Nadi was saying. It's Commonwealth Bank. And on top of that environment, they do a number of different AI and machine learning workloads to do fraud detection, identity theft prevention, credit scoring, lending decisions, all these kinds of things. And they're using a variety of tools. Most of them are open source, including TensorFlow and other things. So this is what's really cool to see. The space that we're in right now. It's actually not boring at all. I agree with Nadi. It's moving very rapidly, but it's something that's tied to everything that we need to do as humans to continue to make progress, and it's tied to open source. So that's pretty cool. The other piece that I think is really interesting, and this gets to Nadi's point of thinking outside of the box, is that people are looking at these tools and they're kind of picking the parts from each of them that they want to use. And so if we take like a machine learning example, you're going to need some infrastructure to run that on. things like servers and networks. You're going to have some sort of application management layer. You're going to have some specific tooling on top of that. And when you look at how you can accomplish that, you can see that there are open source options that you can piece together across all of those layers. And that's really breaking OpenStack apart, like Nadi said, into these composable pieces where you might just be running Ironic, or you might be running Nova and Cinder in different ways. At the OpenStack Summit, there was a really cool keynote demo that we did on day 2. It's on YouTube, and you can go watch it. It was Jakub Pavlik who did it. And what he did is he took Ironic and he provisioned a set of physical servers, and then he turned that into 3 pools of resources. One that was running Kubernetes to manage containers, one that was using Nova to manage virtual machines, and then one that was just bare metal still. On top of that, he deployed a set of other tools that ran this flow through Kafka, Spark, Hadoop, and produced some learnings off of the Twitter feed in real time. And so this is it's a pretty short video. It's maybe like 6 or 7 minutes. I encourage you to go watch that if you're interested in seeing how these things get pieced together. He also used Spinnaker to kind of orchestrate all of the different tools and where they ended up. But this is not just a kind of a pie in the sky science experiment. This is what people are doing now with these tools, and I think that this is really what's going to propel the next generation of usage. So I think that's pretty cool stuff that we're enabling. One of the other things that we talked about in Boston was what do we need to be working on in the OpenStack community. And in earlier this year in February, actually I guess it was March, we had a meeting in Boston, Massachusetts, with the leaders from the technical committee, the user committee, the board of directors, some foundation staff. We had about 40 people there or so. And we wanted to look and see, okay, what are the areas that we need to improve? How do we make progress on it? And what are the top priorities that we should go into 2017 and 2018 with? And out of that meeting, we identified basically 5 different areas that we thought were important to make progress on around OpenStack. The first one was clearly communicating what is OpenStack. And this is one of those things that ever since we launched OpenStack almost 7 years ago now, people have always said, well, what is it? Is it a hypervisor? Is it a cloud in a box? Is it this? Is it that? And they look at all of the different ways that it gets used, and they don't exactly know how to explain it. And then they look at the fact that if you go to our source repositories, we have over 1,000 different projects that people work on, and so it's confusing. And so what we started to do is to try to simplify this and clarify what OpenStack is by way of the use cases and the types of workloads that you run on it. We have something called the Project Navigator on openstack.org/software that lists out now projects by kind of their category of usage, and we're also working on some new material. This is a draft, so don't base anything off of this. But some new material that sort of outlines the map of OpenStack resources and how they interact with each other. Because as you look at it, you'll see that some things are really base level services that everything needs to depend on. Some things are more optional. Some things are supporting services. And so clearly laying out, here are the pieces that you want to use if you're going to do machine learning, if you're going to do virtualization, if you're going to do platform as a service, and explaining that more clearly is one of the work items that we're doing right now. Another area that we wanted to work on was improving the feedback loop. When OpenStack started at our first design summit, we had about 75 people there. So it wasn't very hard to know who was working on Nova and who was working on Swift, and those were the only 2 projects. But as it's grown, and we have 5,000 to 7,000 people at the OpenStack summits now, it's a lot harder for new users to come in and to improve the software and to find the right developers that they should be talking to. So this year, one of the things that we did is we actually split up the way that the OpenStack summit and the design summit were organized so that there are developer-specific sessions that take place outside of the OpenStack summit. And then during the OpenStack summit, we had what we called the forum. And the forum was a chunk of content. They were all working sessions that included developers and users. And the first time that we did this was in Boston. So we definitely learned things to improve and that will change going into our next OpenStack Summit. But it was very cool to see conversations that had been going on for a year on the mailing list, sometimes with threads of 100 or 200 messages. When you just got key people from across the community together for 40 minutes, they were able to get to real answers on things like distributed lock management or logging or a variety of other issues. And so so I think this was a really good start and something that that we can refine, but it's going to be an important tactic to go forward with improving the feedback loop and continuing to scale the community as it keeps growing. Another big one that, as again, it's kind of a necessity with the growth that we've had, but we need to address complexity. And this is something that that can be really hard to do unless you have buy-in from everybody. But I think that in the last 6 months, there's been a lot of agreement across the developer community and the user community that some pieces of OpenStack are just too complicated. There are too many options, too many variables, too much inconsistency between projects. And so this has been something that the technical committee has started to look at ways to standardize certain patterns across projects, things like API usage, things like configuration, a handful of other things, as well as trimming back on some of the projects that are really duplicating efforts in other communities. There are great options out there if you want to do platform as a service, if you want to do container management, and we should be focused on where our strengths are and put our efforts into combining those and making them work well together. So this is another big area. And that goes along with this one, which is collaborating with adjacent communities. As you look across the landscape of what's happening in technology now, there's a lot more out there than just OpenStack. And so one of the things that we did in Boston was we had what we called open source days. And these were sort of mini conferences inside of the OpenStack Summit for about a dozen technologies that are very tightly related to OpenStack. Things like Open vSwitch and Ceph, Kubernetes, others. And this was actually really cool and useful to see leaders from all these communities come together. But I talked to a couple of users, and that was what really convinced me that it was a great idea. Was they said this is really the only place that I can go and have all of these people in one spot. And and what this guy said is, in my data center, I'm running all of these things. So this is what my world looks like. My world is not just OpenStack or just Kubernetes or just whatever. So I thought that this was really valuable, and we have other initiatives that we have around this, especially with, I think the Kubernetes community is one where there's a lot of tight connections that have been going on. And finally, as I said earlier, we're almost 7 years into this, and so we need new community leaders. We need people who are coming up through the ranks and who are taking over positions as project technical leaders or as technical committee members or board of directors. And so we have a working group now that has started to document the paths that you take to go from casual contributor to core contributor to PTL to whatever path you want to take, because I think that in the first 5 or 6 years we were just growing so quickly that a lot of the effort and a lot of the focus was on how do we manage this flood of incoming patches, 100,000 change sets a year that we get, 3,700 developers last year, more developers than any other year. It continues to grow, but we're realizing that this is the point where we really need to take some time and figure out how to expand the group of people that are kind of the core leaders, because they're going to get burned out. They're going to move on. They're going to want to do other things, and we need to have a healthy crop of up and coming leaders. So the other thing that we talked about in Boston, And this ties in a lot to what Nadi was saying about why infrastructure is not boring, and also I think why we're seeing a lot of growth in OpenStack, and that's because we're at this tipping point in cloud right now. And I think that what we're seeing is kind of a second generation of private cloud that's enabling real multi-cloud use cases. And if you look across the industry, whether it's private cloud or public cloud or multi-cloud, hybrid cloud options, you're seeing really rapid growth. It's all growing. I mentioned 44%. 40% is about what AWS is growing at year over year. Azure and Google are in the same ballpark. So we're seeing this across all types of cloud, and it's because of those drivers, those usage drivers that I mentioned earlier. But what I think we've seen that's been really interesting on the private cloud specifically is that when OpenStack was launched, it had a focus on hyperscale clouds, and specifically public clouds. But what happened is, as an open source community, what our development teams did and our users did is they took it into all of the areas that public clouds weren't going. And they expanded what it meant to be a cloud and what clouds could do. We had IPv6 support really early on because one of our telecom users needed IPv6 on their network in 2014. And that was something that I think Amazon just announced last year. So they were doing things that public clouds weren't doing. Geolocality for regulation, for performance, for whatever. Bare metal. Internap is a public cloud provider in the U.S. Rackspace also has a bare metal offering, and I mentioned Commonwealth Bank and others who are doing bare metal in their private clouds. And this is what people made OpenStack do. NFV, on and on. And a big area that we see emerging right now is edge. I'm going to talk a little bit more about edge in a minute, but that's what people did with OpenStack is they made cloud mean more. All of these other use cases. We see this with OpenStack when we ask people what tools do they run in their OpenStack environment. This is the answer that we get from the. This changes a lot, so what we actually generally do is average the two most recent surveys. But you'll see that Kubernetes, OpenShift, which is based on Kubernetes, Cloud Foundry, Mesos, those are all really big ones. But if you add all of these up, you get more than 100% because people are using a lot of different tools as they figure out what they're going to do with their compute storage and networking in OpenStack. We've also seen changes in how people are adopting private clouds, and I think that one of the big shifts is the technology has gotten so much better that smaller teams can adopt it more easily. When we were in Boston, one of the keynotes that we had was from the U.S. Army Cyber School, and they do training for they call them cyber warriors across the Department of Defense in the U.S. And they have a small budget and a small team for this kind of work, and they have basically one person that manages their OpenStack environment, and they do training courses that are available to soldiers all over the world. And they saved millions of dollars by moving from their previous environment to an OpenStack environment. That wouldn't have been possible really if you go back 4 years ago, 3 years ago. The technology was just too immature, and you needed Python developers. So that's been a big change, and it's led to a change in adoption and the kinds of workloads and the kind of users that we see adopting it. And this again, you can see reflected in our user survey. Sometimes people say, okay, well, OpenStack, that's only for the massive users. We had another keynote from eBay. eBay has about 70,000 virtual machines and about 70,000 physical nodes that they manage in Ironic. Those physical nodes, a bunch of them have GPUs in them. They run their machine learning in Kubernetes on top of GPUs and Ironic. It's a really cool environment. But people think, okay, well, that's the scale you have to be at if you want to be using OpenStack. But you look at this and you'll see that it's actually pretty evenly divided into large companies with more than 10,000 employees, medium-sized companies from 1,000 to 10,000, and then companies who are smaller than 1,000. And that's been really cool to see how it's been spreading across the market. The other thing that has changed is the challenges that people talk about in the first few years, when I would talk to users and I would say, okay, well, what problems are you facing? It was always, Neutron doesn't work, or I can't find anybody to hire, or those kinds of problems. But now a lot of times what we hear about is really a focus on how do we embed this into our company? How do we begin to make use of this across our organization? And those questions a lot of times are around culture and processes, more than just the technology and the talent there. So just as we wrap up here, I want to cover a couple other things. This is a Forrester survey from the end of last year that I think is pretty interesting. When asked what their primary cloud computing platform was, organizations pretty evenly picked between internally managed hosted private cloud, and public cloud. And this is something that hasn't changed a lot, which was kind of interesting to see, because if I go back a couple of years, most people that I talked to, they were on one side or the other. They either said, we're working towards 100% in public cloud, or we're never going to go public cloud and we're always going to keep our stuff on premises. But that's changing, and what people are really doing now is they are figuring out how do we use these different clouds in the places that fit best. And so they're trying to figure out how to build this kind of suite of options internally that meet different requirements. We added recently a new category to our OpenStack marketplace, which is at openstack.org/marketplace, called remotely managed private cloud. And this is a new option where companies can have a private cloud that is completely run by someone else, but it's in their data center, in their facility, so it meets whatever requirements they have. GE spoke at the summit about using this model. GE is probably one of the most regulated companies in the world. They make airplane engines and nuclear power facilities and everything that all of the governments care about. So they are also very into finance, especially in the U.S. They settle trillions of dollars of transactions every day. It's crazy. All of the things, they basically went and said, what are the most painful things that we can do as a company, and decided to go do all of them. But what that meant is that there were limits to where they could deploy their applications, and so there's actually an application platform team there that wanted a cloud, knew they couldn't go to a public cloud, but didn't have the expertise and didn't want to spend the time to kind of build their own. So they, in about a month, worked with a partner to build out a remotely managed private cloud on their facilities, and deployed hundreds of applications over there, moved them onto this cloud, and are saving quite a bit of money from their legacy platform. So this is all of these changes are really cool to see happening in our space. And what another company told me is, as they look across those different options, they have 3 C's that they use to evaluate what is the right home for a workload: compliance, cost, and capabilities. And for a long-running workload, something that's going to be around for months or years, it's usually most expensive to put it in a public cloud. However, for getting something up really rapidly, it's usually cheaper and easier to go to public cloud. For certain capabilities, like some of the things we talked about earlier, NFV, bare metal with GPUs, you can get a feature advantage in a private cloud. For other capabilities where you want to just go with something that Google, for instance, is rolling out some pretty cool container technology, public cloud is a good option. And so really it's about finding the multi-cloud advantage and making use of that for all of the workloads that you have. So I said that I was going to talk a minute about edge computing, and then I'll wrap up. Edge computing is something that I come from a data center background. I used to run tens of thousands of servers in big centralized data centers. And edge computing is something that I sort of knew a little bit about, and mostly thought about it in terms of the telco use case of central offices, branch offices, street level kinds of infrastructure, mobile radio tower, base stations, that kind of thing. What's been really interesting to me is as people have begun to rely on these kind of core infrastructure components, they are starting to realize that centralized data centers are not going to meet the needs that we have over the next couple of years, and certainly over the next decade, when you think about how much data is being generated close to all of us, from our phones, from our homes, from our cars, from everything. And so it's not just about telecoms and kind of service providers and carriers that are thinking about this, but we have retail, Walmart, Gap, Target. They are all figuring out what do they do with the thousands of stores that they have, when more and more the customer experience extends beyond walking into a store, picking up a physical item, and going to a checkout counter. More and more, it's I buy it on my phone, and I want it waiting for me. Or, some of them have in-store parking lot drone delivery now. And all these different use cases, what it's doing is it's pushing more and more of the data and more of the load out from the centralized data centers. The telecom use case is an obvious one, as I said, but they're also beginning to get more challenged with things like internet video streaming, which is becoming kind of a default way for people to consume content. And so they have to figure out, how can they manage the stress on their networks by pushing some of those very popular shows, when the next season of House of Cards gets released on Netflix, being able to cache that closer to customers versus just straight from a data center. And talked with some offshore oil companies, manufacturing companies, on and on and on, healthcare companies. So what was really interesting is heading into the Boston Summit, I had about 10 different companies that came to me and they said, what's going on with OpenStack and Edge? Because we're doing this and we're doing it this way and this is what we think. And they were all kind of looking at it differently and doing things slightly differently. So I said, well, why don't we get together just informally at the summit in Boston and figure out, how we should organize this. And I thought we were going to have 10 or 15 people. We ended up having about 120 people that showed up from all of these different organizations all over the world. And we've kicked off an initiative now inside of OpenStack to figure out what the right patterns and models are for doing Edge with OpenStack. And it's been pretty interesting to watch that develop. But the next kind of milestone that we have around this is an event in September called Open Dev. It's going to be in San Francisco. And the programming committee for this is Ericsson, AT&T, Verizon, eBay, and Walmart. And this is going to be a working event. It's going to be working sessions meant to develop reference architectures, requirements to go back upstream, kind of the use cases that people are seeing now and where they think this is going to go over the next decade. So if this is a topic area that you're interested in, I'd love to meet up with you today and we can get you involved in moving this forward. Last couple announcements. The next OpenStack Summit will be in Sydney, and hope to see some of you there, but after just flying here from Melbourne, I will understand if you don't go there. It's yeah, it took me 26 hours or something. Oh, well, no. The next one after that's going to be in Vancouver, which isn't necessarily a lot closer, but probably easier. Yes. And then the one after this one will be in Europe. We hopefully will be able to announce the location in the next month or so. So that's all I have, and thank you very much for having me back, and look forward to talking with you today.